Currently, there are 37 in
Wow.
the United States. I was the 13th American.
What got you interested in wine?
Actually, I grew up in Spain, and then we moved to the United States right before I started college. And I went back to Spain sophomore year in college and to visit an uncle who's a big wine aficionado.
Yeah.
And he just got me hooked up on the whole history, the passion that people have about making wine, the different philosophies about how everybody thinks that the best wine should be made, even in the same region. And I came back and I found out that here I was going to the University of California, Davis, which was the place to learn about wine in this country.
Did you go there on purpose?
No, I happened to be going there by coincidence. It was purely coincidental, and I got a couple of friends involved, and eventually 3 of us ended up in the business.
Wow, interesting.
So it was,
So how did you get to be at the Ritz-Carlton?
when I finished Davis, what I was most interested in was not so much production, but the end product itself, the history of a particular vineyard, the persona that made it, the different philosophies, and the wide variety of wines from all over the world. So initially I went to work for a gentleman in Sacramento called Darryl Cordy, who's one of the most prominent wine merchants in the country. And then I moved to Southern California and ended up at the Westin, South Coast Plaza, as a sommelier, and got called by the Ritz-Carlton a couple of years later to come over and head up their program at this beautiful property about 11 years ago. And about 7 years ago, I moved to the Ritz in San Francisco to start that program in that property.
Well, you're in the best restaurant city almost in the whole world. I mean, people in San Francisco really know their wines. They really do. They surprise you sometimes?
I was surprised the very first week I worked in San Francisco, because I remember somebody asking me about a particular vintage of a wine from an area in Provence called Mas de Damas Casac, a very rare wine. And here was this, I had just studied this wine a few months earlier to pass my Master Sommelier exam, and the first time I had read about it or anything. And here was this customer asking me about the particular differences in the vintages of a wine that I had barely just heard of.
Maybe it's a trick question.
So I always, from that moment on, I always am on my toes when I'm in San Francisco. You can never take somebody's knowledge too lightly or not highly enough regarded.
That's very true. That's very true. Now, I would imagine that you're also in charge of buying for the wine list as well.
Right. In San Francisco, I'm in charge of selecting, pricing, and buying all the wines for all the lists, regardless if it's just the master list for the dining room, but also for banquets, room service. And
right. But right now, you're probably buying and selling wine for what, the year 2010?
Well, not so much 2010, especially. I wouldn't even say that out loud in case my accountant might hear this. But you know, we've been looking forward to the millennium now for a couple of years, and not just the millennium, but the evening of the year 2000, which is going to be a huge event. Also, it's the start of another millennium, not just the ending of one. So we've been concentrating on champagne and purchasing champagne and thinking about what kind of programs, what kind of wines we're going to use for those years. And then as great vintages appear in California or in France and Spain, we just had a myriad of terrific vintages, we like to stockpile on those exceptional wines, because it's not often that an area gets an exceptional vintage.
Right.
So we like to jump on it as soon as we can, so we're able to get fairly competitive prices. And then,
now, what can a consumer do, just an individual consumer, to so-called maximize if they want to start a collection? How would they begin?
Well, I think the most important thing about starting a collection, buy what you like, not what you're supposed to buy or what other people say you buy, or whether it's a master sommelier or a wine merchant. I mean, I think you have to really collect what it is you have a passion for. I think, though, as you move along, you tend to develop taste. And for me, I started buying a lot of white wine. And I noticed that I didn't drink enough. So it started getting too much white wine, some of it getting too old, and eventually some of it, becoming worthless because it had sat in my cellar for too long and I hadn't consumed it fast enough.
Right.
So I cut back my buying of white wine and increased my buying of other wines. I started buying a lot of vintage port, but now I find that I almost enjoy tawny port more.
Yeah.
And so
So your taste has changed.
yeah, my taste changes as the years go by. There's so many new and exciting new areas coming on board.
Yeah.
Whether you're talking about Australia or regions within Spain that are coming up, or Italy, that you find new discoveries. And as I mentioned in the beginning, what I enjoy most is the huge variety of wine.
Right.
So I'm not a person that just collects Bordeaux or Burgundy, although I love those wines. But I'm interested in the whole spectrum of different wines and foods. And I think that's what makes life exciting. And so when you find those little jewels, I like to buy them and keep them in my cellar. So it's constantly changing.
Yeah, definitely. Now let's just turn to the restaurateur. Right, you and I both know that everyone's dream, a lot of people's dream, is to own a restaurant. I don't know why that is, but chefs are the sex symbols of today for some reason.
Sure.
And everybody just dreams of having a restaurant. The difficulty of having a restaurant and having a great wine list is that you don't have the cellar, maybe. And maybe you don't have the budget to lay out so much money. So how would you advise, a medium-priced or a small restaurant to start doing their upper tier of wines?
Well, I think, for one, obviously, in whether we like it or not, in most environments, whether it's Ritz-Carlton or you're starting up a restaurant, cash flow is the name of the game, especially when you're allocating such a huge chunk of capital to inventory. Whether however little or as much money as it can be, you want to have a turnover ratio that's good with your wines. For that reason, I find, especially like if we take Bordeaux for example, I find that the prices that are being asked for 95 and 96 Bordeaux are extremely high. That you can find bargains in, say, vintages like 85 or 88, 89, 90, wines that are already mature, that are already perfect for restaurant usage, and wines that cost a lot less than the equivalent quality in a new wine that's just exciting right now because it's just coming out, and so many more people are getting to wine that the prices are very high for those wines. But you can buy wine, the same wine that's 10 years old, probably close, if not better in quality, for a lesser price.
Can we talk prices in terms of case? Do you have any rough?
Well, I think two things. One, we tend to focus too much on a specific vintage and saying this vintage has been lauded by the press as a great vintage, and therefore that's what I'm going to collect. There's so many great bargains to be found out there in vintages that weren't necessarily great, but in many instances a great vintage makes for a softer, lighter, more approachable wine. And if it was still well made, and many of the top, for example, Chateau, what they do in an off vintage is make a very rigorous selection. So they may declassify 70-80% of the crop and just keep the 20% best of what they made, and still make a very good wine. But because of this image that the vintage has, you can find, if we talk about, say, a great Bordeaux property, Côte d'Estournel, for example, in Saint Estèphe, you may be able to find a 92 Côte d'Estournel for $350 a case wholesale. A 95, which is a much superior wine, but it'll cost you $800 or $900, and it will not be ready to drink.
For a case?
For a case.
Okay.
While an 86 or 87 might cost you $650 for that case. So the 95 isn't ready to drink. It's a lot more expensive, and you're going to have to obviously translate those costs onto the customer when you put it on the list. I think a good way of buying wines is to whether it be buying through private sellers, which often, often come up. People have bought too much wine, and you get calls about whether people are interested in purchasing private sellers, or at auctions, whether they be Butterfields, Christie's, Sotheby's.
How do people find out about private sellers?
Well, I think it's in private sellers. There's a lot of word of mouth. You know, as if you work in an area and people kind of get drawn to you. They find out that this is a restaurant that's interested in wine, that does an aggressive wine program, that has a lot of wine by the glass, that seems to have a very good selection, whether it be big or small. Inevitably, you get calls from people. Oh, by the way, I have some cases. Are you interested? You know, in purchasing these?
So the private seller is called a restaurant.
Many of the time, most of the time they do. Or you have customers that come in and say, you know what? I had 5 cases of, 85 Jordan Cabernet. I'm never going to drink them, or I don't drink as much as I used to. My cellar's too big.
Right.
Would you be interested? And so that comes up a lot with even the customers that come into the restaurant.
How can a restaurateur put themselves in the loop and just say, how do they find out? Just put themselves in the loop so that people know about them and all that.
Well, I think you might. One of the ways to do it is to develop a relationship with a good wine merchant in town, because that's a source. A lot of people go to wine merchants to see if they're interested in purchasing cellars. And a lot of times a wine merchant will not be able to do it at that time, or isn't maybe interested in a wholesaler. So if you develop a relationship with a wine merchant, and for example, sometimes you have emergencies, you run out of wine.
Yeah.
So I have a couple of wine merchants that I call and say, can I borrow a case? And so I go and borrow a case, return it, and I refer customers to them.
Yeah.
When they have wines that they like, where can they buy them? I refer them to those. So we've developed a relationship where we each help each other. And oftentimes the wine merchant will say, look, the cellar came up. I can't really take it at this time. Would you be interested in taking a look? Here's the name and number of this person, because they're helping perhaps a customer of theirs getting rid of a cellar that they may not be able to absorb at that time.
Let's talk about auctions now. You were talking about Christie's and Butterfields, and these names I think most people associate with high-ticket items.
Sure.
So you're saying you can get a bargain with wine?
I think, obviously the big ticket names and the most famous properties it's going to be a little tougher to get bargains at places like Christie's or Sotheby's. But there are plenty of lesser chateaux of typically good vintages are offered, not necessarily some great vintages. So you have the whole spectrum at an auction. You have superlative wines from great vintages, and you have good wines from good vintages. And in that good wines from good vintages, there's maybe not quite as much action or not as much excitement as is generated by the Lafitte's of 1990 or 1982 Mouton or things like that. And they kind of tend to get passed by. And in that caliber, you can find a lot of good. So you may not find Lafitte at a bargain, but you may find Bechevel or Chateau Gloria or Chateau de Pez, or a number of smaller properties that still produce very nice wine, and you get a wine that's maybe 8, 12 years old, nice wine, nice property at a very good price that you can pass on to your customers.
Well, you're very modest, and you're a master sommelier, and you would be able to go to an auction with no problem and recognize all these things, but let's say somebody hasn't had that education. I don't know if an auction would be the best step for them.
No, you don't want to go into an auction. I mean, when I go into auction, I've reviewed the catalog, I've researched the wine, I know and that's the other important thing. Don't get caught up in the excitement of an auction. Have a number that you're willing to pay for something, and don't go over that, because one of the problems is you get excited and you start bidding, and you start paying a lot more than you otherwise might have paid. Even if you walk out of there with nothing, make sure that you decide what it is, that it is a good price, a fair price for the wine that you're bidding for. So with auctions, you do have to do a lot of research before you walk in, because there's split-second decisions that you have to make.
So you would get the printout of what's being offered. You would maybe go to your wine merchant or somebody who you trust to.
Sure, or you can see printouts of other auctions of what the wines have brought in previous auctions. So you get an idea. Okay, this is a fair price for this wine, and that becomes your goal, and then you stick to that. And If it's too high, then you pass over and you
Yeah.
wait for the next one. And you maybe, if you have a budget of $5,000, then you research $8,000 worth of wine that you might bid on,
Right.
because you know you're not going to win everything. And so
Yeah.
you kind of set up your strategy in that manner.
Well, I'm sure you have a lot of fun at the Ritz-Carlton doing all this. But if you were a medium-sized restaurant, how would you set up your wine list? Would you keep it fairly small, under so many bottles?
You know, I think the most difficult thing to do is to make a great small wine list.
Oh.
I mean, to make a wine list like I have, 600
Yeah.
items, you just have a bunch of great stuff from great
Right.
vintages, and you try, although we do try to focus on smaller producers from a number of different areas. So, but it is much harder to make a great small list than it is to make a great large list.
Yeah.
Because the margin for error is
Well, what
much
is your
smaller.
customers? Would you be able to say their favorite wine or what you sell the most of in your restaurant?
Well, I think you have to identify what your cuisine is and what set of wines you think go well with that cuisine, and have that be the main focus, not the whole focus, but the main
Right.
focus of what you want to do. The way I pick wines is, for example, if I were going to do a small list, I would figure out what type of wine I think goes well with my dish. Within that category, I would break it further down in terms of, okay, I'm going to have, let's say, Chardonnay, for example. I think Chardonnay is going to go great with a number of dishes on my
Right.
list. Then I'll pick a $50 Chardonnay, a $40 Chardonnay, and a $30 Chardonnay, which I think represent the best value at their price range.
Right.
And maybe I'll pick two of them.
Is that retail on the
No,
list?
on
or-
the list,
Okay.
on the list prices.
Wow.
And maybe I'll pick two at each price, so get a variance of price, and within that same price, pick two or three that are in different styles. So I may get a barrel fermented Chardonnay,
Yeah.
maybe a stainless steel fermented Chardonnay, one a heavier, one a oakier, one a fruitier, one a crisper. So you get a variance of style and a variance of price. And you may want to get a few producers that are a little bit better known,
Right.
and then a few that are maybe a little bit
More
lesser
obscure.
known that you can introduce people to, because some people, when they come to a restaurant, they like to have something that they're comfortable with,
Right.
and then don't like to experiment. Other people love to try something new, find out what's the new hot little guy out there,
Yeah.
and run and get it. So you want to try to cover those things, and you can do that with a small wine list. It just means that your selection process has to be that much more organized and that much more thought out.
It seems like you have a very nice strategy for that.
Well, I think it's one that I've developed through the years, through, as you basically on the floor, you learn
Yeah.
what people want, what they like. Not, the floor is very humbling, because fairly soon you get away from what you think are the best wines, and you start to understand what it is people really like and what they really enjoy. And then you
Right.
kind of mold your program to what it is your customers are really asking for and what they really want.
So at the Ritz-Carlton in San Francisco, the waiters really have nothing to do with wine. If a consumer asks a question, they refer it to you.
Well, yes. Oh, and in San Francisco, we have an assistant. We usually have two sommeliers on the floor. Plus, though, we do spend a fair amount of time educating the captains and the waiters
Okay.
on new wines, on different wines, because we don't want, inevitably sometimes when it's busy, you're caught up and you can't
Right.
attend to every single table and can't get, and we do like to have people on the floor that are educated. Obviously they're not expected to have the
Right.
level of knowledge of a sommelier. We're not expecting our captains or wait staff to have that, but we are expecting them to have a good, solid knowledge, know what the specials are, know what wines go with them, and know how they taste. We have tastings, and so we
That's
talk.
great.
We try to talk a language which is simple, to the point, and not too technical, so that people will understand. But they'll also understand the differences when you talk about one wine versus another, in a simple, direct language.
So as a consumer, a lot of times I look at all the Chardonnays, and maybe there are things I'm not really familiar with, and I say to the waiter, I'd like a buttery, oaky Chardonnay. And so you instruct your wait staff. If somebody says this to you, you should
this is
offer
what,
this. Okay.
and usually when a new wine comes in, I'll say, okay, this is a new wine. I'll give a little background
Yeah.
story, who's the person behind it, where does it come from,
Right.
how much they make, and what style it is.
Yeah.
If it's a fuller bodied oaked style Chardonnay. And so the waiters have a pretty good idea of what a good portion of the wines on the list, what they're like and what stylistically they're like.
Do you ever have tastings where you pair some wines with food, or you just offer the rudiments of spicy things go with this? Or
No, we do have tastings with wine. I think the most